Appreciate everyone being here this afternoon. We'll start by saying you hear the water running in the background. That's a good thing. Hopefully we'll get to use it again real soon. Hopefully it's not distracting or anything when you get it filled back up. As in preaching, sometimes there are certain sermons that cause more, anxiety to the presenter, sometimes because of anticipation of how it may be received by those it's being presented to. And one thing as long as I've been preaching, been doing really textual series, and that has helped me to maintain and stay in lessons. Sometimes, rather than cowering or saying, okay, well, I'm not going to present a certain lesson or whatever because I don't, how people may be affected or retaliation and those types of things. Run with it, and they come up whenever they come up. And so sometimes different lessons come up and at different times. Sometimes they seem very timely, sometimes maybe not so much, but certainly see God's providence in that. But it's interesting as we're in the book of 1 Timothy, and we come now to 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 to 15, instructions to women. This passage is not well received to many in the world, and many times even in the church. But I think it's very timely. And I think as we go along with it, many of you may see what I'm talking about in this. The purpose of 1 Timothy is found in 1 Timothy 3, verses 14 and 15. So let's look for the purpose of this letter. He states, "These things I write to you." We know the things that were prior to and the things coming after. In this letter he wrote to 1 Timothy, Paul writing to this young preacher, he said, "These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly, but if I'm delayed, I write so that," now writing is more permanent. So you'll have this in writing. You can read it, Timothy, a number of times. Share it with others. It's going to be shared. And he says, "I write," and the reason is so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. That means there is an importance to how we conduct ourselves in the church. He says, which is the church, the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. All right, so the purpose of the whole letter, all of these things, is so that we can know, we have that knowledge. We don't have to guess. We don't have to assume. We don't look at it and go, well, this is what I think. We can know how we ought to conduct ourselves in the church, that we might know how to conduct ourselves in God's family, which is the church. Consider Paul's instruction to men regarding prayer in 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 to 8. We looked at 2 weeks ago how ought to pray, how to conduct themselves. Well, in 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 to 15, Paul addresses the women and gives instructions concerning their adornment. 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 and 10, in like manner also. In like manner to the way he was addressing the men, in like manner, meaning this is commandments, this is inspired. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. So we see Paul addressing women and gives instructions concerning their adornment, and we're going to look at this in depth, and also instructions concerning their submission. 1 Timothy 2, now verses 11 to 15. "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control." So it's out there. We've read it. Timothy read it when he got the letter. He probably read it a number of times so he would know how he ought to conduct himself and how he would preach and teach to others in the church how they should conduct themselves. We've read it now. His instructions may seem antiquated. But women seeking to please God will do well to give the earnest heed. Now, men, we can learn some things as we go along too. We're going to look at this and see how things would apply to the men also a bit. Consider then what is written about the adornment of women. In like manner, just as men are to pray everywhere, earlier in the earlier in the chapter, verse 8, without wrath, without doubting. And there the Greek word for men is aner. Aner would be males. Anthropos is translated man or men. Anthropos, anthropois would be mankind, men and women. So when we see that, it's men and women. But if we see aner, it's males. When we see gune, we know that is female. And so here, in like manner. So these instructions apply to gune as women, apply everywhere, without wrath, without doubting. The apostle had stated particularly the duty of men in public worship in verse 8, or dealings with the church, if you will. Now he proceeds to state the duty of women within the church, not specifically, but certainly including worship. All the directions here evidently refer to the proper, according to God's inspired word, manner of conducting public worship, not to private duties within this context. And the object here is to state the way in which he would have the different genders appear. He had stated that he would have prayers offered for all people, verse 1 and following of chapter 2, and that in offering such petitions, he would have the men on whom the duty of conducting public devotion lied with, do it with holy hands, meaning those set apart, those men who had set themselves apart for God's work, doing them sanctified, obedient to the gospel. Certainly Christians within that, do it with holy hands, without any intermingling of passion, and with entire freedom from the spirit of contention. Holy hands, so there's no contention. Men, pray without contentions, without strife. In reference to the duty of females in attendance on public worship, he says that he would have them appear in apparel suitable to the place and the occasion, adorned not after the manner of the world, but with the zeal, with the love in the cause of the Redeemer, which became Christian. Adorn themselves. The adornment of women in like manner, adorn themselves in modest apparel. Literally, adorn themselves in adorning attire. The word modest means orderly, well-arranged, decent, well-arranged, becoming, proper. It does not, in its proper context, in its proper meaning, it does not mean modest in the sense of being opposed to that which is immodest. Now, some say, "Oh, well, good. That's a freeing there. That's a loophole there." But you got to stick with it. It's not speaking of that which tends to excite improper passions and desires, but it's stating that which is becoming or appropriate of its surroundings, of the reason of coming together. What constitutes proper apparel is further defined by Paul as he continues with propriety and moderation. Now, again, there's other passages throughout the Bible that talks about how women should adorn, and men, with that meaning also, should adorn. It says in public. This is talking about within worship. Really, should he even have needed to say, women don't wear things that are immodest that would make even people blush outside the church. Certainly don't bring them to wear that to worship. But still, it's bringing it in. So it's getting our minds focused on this with propriety and moderation. Propriety means a sense of shame. A sense of shame, that it would be shameful to be seen in public best that way. A shrinking from trespassing the boundaries of propriety. Proper reserve. Moderation, translated sobriety in the King James translation, means sanity, then sober-mindedness. You know, some would say, you got to be out of your mind to wear something like that. But yet, someone will wear it to worship something. You know, that's sober-mindedness. Moderation of the desires. Moderation of the passions. It is opposed to all that is frivolous and to all undue excitement of the passions. The idea is that in their apparel and deportment, they should not entrench on the strictest decorum. They should continue to be modest and proper. And he goes on in our text, not with braided hair, gold, pearls, or costly clothing. Note that Paul is not dealing with the brevity of clothing per se. He's not talking about the lack of clothing in this, actually. Rather, clothing and hairstyles designed to draw the attention of others. Designed to draw the attention of others. Of course, drawing attention through brevity of clothing would violate the spirit of the letter. Right? So being scantily clad would certainly try to draw the attention of others, so that would be applicable within this, but he's not specifically talking about that per se, as well as the word translated propriety or shamefacedness. Is Paul condemning all adorning of the hair or wearing of jewelry? That would be a question that would come up. Compare what Paul wrote in 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. So, outward appearance is important. All right, and so for men, said we can learn some things too, because sometimes you may hear men, even within the church, saying, it don't matter what I wear. God don't care what I wear. Well, obviously it matters what women wear. Why doesn't it matter what men wear? To say, well, I can wear whatever I want to, and you can't tell me. Well, that attitude throws one out to begin with. That is not sober-minded in even thinking that way. And so the outward, he says, do not let your adornment be merely outward. Both appear to use a comparative not. I want to think about that, where not is not used as a literal prohibition. All right, for example, let's look at John 6, verse 27. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. Now, when we look at that, did Jesus condemn working for food? He says, do not labor for the food which perishes. That would be the food that we eat. And he just says, don't labor for that, right? If we're using that word not, if we're going to do it, you can't pick and choose. He was emphasizing what is most important. It's really don't labor not just this, but this. So Sarah, we have an example. Sarah evidently adorned herself such that her beauty could not be hidden. Genesis chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. But her true beauty was adornment of a meek and quiet spirit. So we go on in 1 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6 now. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women, so those women who had set themselves apart, who they were sanctified, the holy women who trusted in God, also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are. And this is Peter. This is New Testament. Using an Old Testament example, but he's talking to Christian women and says, you daughters of Sarah, if Your daughters are Sarah, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror, doing good within a. So it cannot be supposed that the mere braiding of the hair is forbidden in our text, but only that careful attention to the manner, the attitude of doing it, and to the ornaments usually worn in it. If one adorned hair, obviously in the first century there were adornments and things put in the hair which characterized worldly females. Are there designs and apparel today that women wear that characterize worldliness? We would have to honestly say, yes, there is. There's certain clothing and designs and the way things are that certainly show worldly. Men, are there men's clothing that do the same? Yes, there are. Yes, there are. So we're not exempt. We don't get to sit back and go, okay, call me Lord, and I get to wear what I want to, and I get to tell you what you want to. The Bible takes care of all that. And so when we're looking at this, it cannot be supposed that the mere braiding of the hair is forbidden, but only that attention, that attitude of the manner of doing it. And to the ornaments usually worn, characterizing worldly females. It is not to be supposed that all use of gold or pearls as articles of dress is here forbidden. But the idea is that the Christian female is not to seek these as adorning which she desires, as adornment that excites the desires of others, or is not to imitate the world in these personal decorations. So he goes on and says, but which is proper. So don't do this, but this. Not this, but this. Not just this, but also this. But which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Here is where the emphasis is to be. Not on outward apparel, as per 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of the Lord. So how one desires, what's one's desire in this instance, and how one is presenting themselves outwardly, how's one dressing for worship? But this certainly, the principles would apply to going out anywhere. Should we not profess Christianity in the workplace? You know, wherever we go, is that not? We're either professing worldliness or we're professing Christianity. That manifestation of where our mind is set. And so, if we think about how one dresses for worship, it does matter. For someone to say, well, God doesn't care what I wear, if that's the best you got, no, he don't. But if the attitude is, I'm going to wear whatever I want to wear, and I'm not going to show reverence or respect for anybody else, especially to God, does he care? Yes, he does. Absolutely he does. So he's talking about here, good works befits women professing godliness, godly piety. Now we think about that. We have an example in Acts chapter 9, verse 36 of Dorcas. At Joppa, there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. Acts 9 and verse 39. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. Sisters in Christ, what do men notice about you? What do you think men notice about you within our assemblies and outside? That is a question that Christian sisters should always ask. Christian brothers, what do women notice about you? the same question applies. Attention to physical adornment or your godly conduct? Where's the focus? Do we put the time put into adorning oneself is the same amount of time put into adorning oneself spiritually? It's where our emphasis is. It's where our desires are. Be careful not to let the physical take precedent. It's not that there's no importance at all, but it shouldn't take precedent. A little exercise is good for the body. Not saying don't ever exercise, but studying, professing godliness, that is much more important. So be careful not to let the physical take precedent and block out the spiritual. So now consider Paul's instructions regarding. If that wasn't hard enough, that wasn't difficult enough, we've got to consider Paul's instructions, inspired instructions regarding the submission of women. Learn in silence with all submission, to be in silence. The word silence, translated quietness, quietly, found here and in Acts 22 and verse 2, all the more silent. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 12, work in quietness. Related to the word used in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 2, peaceable life. I think we get the message. I think we can start grasping what is being said here. The apostle goes on to give some other instructions to women, how they should behave themselves in public worship in the church. He would have them be learners and not teachers. Sitting here, learn more of Christ, of the truth of the gospel, to maintain good works. Would have them learn in silence, not offer to rise and speak under a pretense of having a word from the Lord. First century, some of them, there were prophetesses, if you will, in the first century. That was prophesied that it would be the case. So they may have received word. They were not to stand and say what they were being told. They were hearing. That restriction was placed on them. But even now the same principles apply today. One being under an impulse of the Spirit of the Lord, or some frantic women have done. And if they should meet with anything under the ministry of the Word they did not understand, or they had an objection to, they were not to speak in public, but ask their own husbands at home. Consider 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35. Paul writing to the church there in Corinth, Christians there, let your women keep silent in the church. Okay? Verb tense, let your women keep on keeping silent in the churches. For they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive. They are to always be being submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church, or when the church comes together, or there's church things that, we have to look at that within the context and what is being said, and we can't change it to fit our needs or what we want it to be. And thus they were to behave with all subjection, both to the if you will, the ministers of the word and to their own husbands. Thus, women should listen attentively to instruction without attempting to teach in public. Do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority. Note that this pertains to over a man. Don't have authority over a man. Are they to have any authority? As long as it's not over a man. They can have. There's some authority to be had. Compares comment those we just looked at in 1 Corinthians 14. Women may certainly teach other women, children. Titus 2, verses 3 and 4, we see this coming in. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior. If the older women would maintain the reverence and behavior, the younger women will learn that, and it would perpetuate itself. When the older women are not reverent in behavior, then the younger women do not have that example to follow. They can gain that knowledge through studying, but they don't have that seeing. Not slanderers. They say older women. Well, some people say they can be 70 years old, 80 years old. Well, I ain't older. Some 60 years old, 50 years old. Well, I ain't older. Yeah, you are. Older than somebody. You're older than the 40s. You're older than the 30s. You're older than the 20s. So you're older women. So likewise, older women, be reverent in behavior, not slanderers. Don't talk about stuff that you ain't got no business talking about. Don't talk. There's things that are decided. Sometimes there's an eldership, the elders decide. If not, we have men's meetings, there's things decided. Don't slander that. No, you be reverent in behavior. Be silent. There's things that you speak about that you don't know anything about. And he says, don't do that. He says, don't be given to much wine. Say, well, I don't do that. Okay, don't do both of them. Teachers of good things. Teaching good things. Well, how do we teach? Does it have to be just in a classroom? Can women not teach the younger women in more public environment? We're fellowshipping together, meal, whatever, teaching good things. How to not be slanderers. That they admonish the young women to love their husbands. There's you something to talk about. If you can't find anything else to talk about this. To love their children. Talk about that. Those are good things. Those are important that they be shared. Both 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 and 12, and 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 to 37, appear to deal with the conduct of women coming together as the church and worship in the assemblies of the church. Reasons and reassurances for such conduct. Why? He's not leaving it blank saying this is what I want. No reasons. Reasons for the submission of women in the church. 1 Timothy 2, verses 13 and 14. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Well, that ain't good enough for me. Well, Adam wasn't deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Is that good enough for you? One should be enough, but he gives two. Adam was formed first, then Eve. Man was made as the Lord of this lower creation and placed in the garden. And then the woman was made of a rib taken from his side and given to him not as a Lord but as a companion. It's irrefutable. That's the pattern that God set into place. All the circumstances combined to show the subordinate nature of her rank. Not in her demeanor, not in her knowledge, not in her strength, not in anything other than the rank placed by God. And to prove that she was not designed to exert authority over the man. Consider 1 Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. That is not something that can be overlooked. Some say, well, but that makes me uncomfortable. Then be uncomfortable. And the longer that we learn it and come to grips with it, that comfort will come. But it's plainly stated. And we can't add to, we can't take away, we can't change it. We shouldn't want to because we know the source of it is perfect and we don't know everything. Adam was not deceived. Eve, being deceived, fell into transgression. You ever noticed neither the serpent nor Eve deceived Adam? Sure about that? Yeah, for sure. He allowed himself to be persuaded by Eve after she ate. Genesis 3, verse 17. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. He didn't say because you were deceived. He said, because you heeded the voice of your wife. The woman's susceptibility to deception is thus offered as a reason. Oh, you're saying women are more susceptible than men. I believe God said that. As the general pattern, this is a reason that is stated. Is thus offered as a reason why women are not to have a leadership role over men in the church. Reassurances for women who learn in submission. Chapter 2, verse 15, she'll be saved in childbearing. Now, to be understood not of a temporal salvation or being saved through childbearing, through the perilous time to be delivered out of it. Now, though this is generally the case, yet not always, nor always the case of good women, Rachel died in childbirth. And so it's not saying, it's saying in general. So those subject to man with no leadership role in the church, susceptible to bearing children, is pain, sorrow. Genesis 3 and verse 16. Now, is it the same? Is it as excruciating pain as kidney stones? Still left to be determined. A woman can be saved as well as a man. That's what it's saying. So a woman can be saved just as a man can. There's no difference. He doesn't save men in a different way than he saves women. But there's going to be childbirth. It's a general pattern. We think about that. Genesis 3 and verse 16, the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? The woman said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. So we see the serpent deceived Eve, did not deceive Adam. We see in chapter 3, verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Okay, so it's bringing that together under the new covenant. We look at there is no distinction in salvation between males and females. In authority, in duties that are set forth, there are. So she can be saved even in the function of childbearing, not by means of it. Meaning, even though as painful as it may be, and there may be death in childbirth, that if she's faithful, she's still going to be found favorable with God. Paul is not saying women must bear children to be saved. Some would go to that extreme. For he teaches elsewhere the value of the single life in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 32 to 35. Generally speaking, this is God's creative purpose for women, motherhood. That's the general purpose. That's the general pattern that was set forth. It doesn't mean that it's a violation of anything, if that not be the case, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty, self-restraint. Faith, love, holiness, virtues necessary for salvation. Modesty, self-restraint, virtues necessary for submission. So we've looked at salvation, we've looked at submission. So in a world obsessed with fashion and equality, can we not agree that the world is obsessed with fashion? We'll start with just fashion. Is the world not obsessed with fashion? I mean, billions and trillions of dollars spent on fashions. What's the in color now? What's the in fashion now? Is it higher or lower necklines? Is it higher or lower skirt lines? Man, is it flannel or is it silk? Is it are polos in this year? Or has it got to be the alligator? It's all about the fashion and stuff. Inherently, there's nothing wrong. Some clothing manufacturers make better clothes. They last longer. Is it prudent to say, well, I'd rather pay a little more and it lasts a little longer? There ain't nothing wrong with that. But if we're obsessed with fashion, if we're obsessed with equality, is the world today not obsessed with equality? I would say, yes, it is. I mean, you can't deny that. The things that are going on, the different facets of our world. It's not easy to be a daughter of Sarah today. Our sisters, man, we need to recognize it's not easy for our sisters to be daughters of Sarah today. It's not impossible, but it's not easy. Man, we know it's not easy be men of God. It's not impossible, but it's not easy. You recognize that. There are things pulling in different ways. But for women, we're looking at this in this context, making a claim to godliness. Okay? Women making a claim to godliness. Their adornment will be modest and discreet, accompanied with good works. For women making a claim to godliness, their service will be faith, love, and holiness, accompanied by submission and self-restraint. Some might say, well, this might be a lesson that should have been taught in the morning so that more people could listen to it. Sad part, it shouldn't matter whether it's preached in the morning sermon or the afternoon sermon. Sad not more people are in this auditorium listening because it's important. In the words of Peter, such conduct is 1 Peter 3, verses 4 and 5. Very precious in the sight of God. Do you want to be precious in the sight of God? For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves. Just think about that part. And then you can add, looking at adorn themselves in propriety and modesty also. Very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves. Difficult lesson? I'm sweating. It's hard. There are things that are difficult, not impossible. There are things that are difficult that as we grow, as we mature, as individual Christians, as a congregation. What kind of congregation is this? What kind of congregation is this congregation? That is a question that we've got to ask. No, we don't have elders. Lord willing, we will at some point. We have 2 or more qualified men with qualified wives, then we'll have elders. Until then, as best we can determine, we have men's business meeting. Scripturally speaking, and I'm going to speak on behalf of the men. We'll have a meeting here in a little bit. Y'all can rebuke me if you want to at that point. I'm asking the women of the congregation to respect the decisions that are made in the men's business meeting. Don't slander it. Don't try to change it. Don't try to overcome it. Don't try to do anything other than submit. We're doing the best that we can. If there are scriptural reasons, then present those. And if the men of this congregation are sound, then we'll make those changes. If they're matters of opinions, be in silence. As Christians, to be Christians, we've got to hear the gospel. This is part of the entire New Testament that we're just looking at. But it's that mindset, it's that attitude of the gospel. Believing the gospel. Repenting of all sins. Making the good confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Being immersed in the waters of baptism. Following that repentance. Being immersed in the waters of baptism, God raising them a new creature to walk and keep on walking in newness of life. If you haven't done that, you're not a Christian, but most, if not all of us that are at that age here have. Are we walking faithfully? Women, are you adhering to the things that we just talked about? Maybe that was new to your hearing, and it's going to take some time, some effort to make some adjustments, but please do. Others may say, I've heard it a number of times and I've got it. Good, you got it again? Share it with others. Share it with the other women so that the next generations will know these things. How sad it is that when a younger generation has to correct the older generation. For us men, are we doing our duties? Are we doing the things we should be doing? We have responsibility. And in the absence of anyone meeting those responsibilities, we put a stumbling block in front of the women to where they'll say, I'll do it. Now we're both at fault. We must be very careful. The Scripture is very plain. We kind of get it confused a lot of times, and we cause a lot of chaos. But it's understandable. So we, individually and collectively, must continue to be faithful all the way until death, and we'll receive the crown of life. If we can help anyone in any way, please come as together we stand and sing.